think for some of us to wake up, we need a wake-up call. And in 1986, I got the call. I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California. And I was on the biking portion of the race. And I was making a turn, and there was a police officer on the corner. And he was pointing to me to make the turn. But he had his back to the oncoming traffic. So I was passing two cyclists on the corner, and when I made the turn, a four-wheel drive vehicle going pretty fast catapulted me out of my bike. When I landed, I broke 6 vertebrae in my spine. And when you land in a vertical position, the compressive force takes the columns of the vertebrae and flattens them. So I had compressed 6 vertebrae. But when you compress those vertebrae, the volume of that mass has to go somewhere, and it went back against my spinal cord. When my body landed, it kind of whipped forward, and the top vertebrae out of the 6 that were broken was more than 60% collapsed, and the arch that the spinal cord passed through had broken like a pretzel. So I had multiple compression fractures, I had bone fragments on the spinal cord, and I had the neural arch of the athoracic vertebrae compressing the cord, and I was in a little bit of trouble. And I had 4 opinions from 4 leading surgeons in Southern California, and the typical surgery for that type of injury is called a Harrington rod surgery. And they do a complete laminectomy of the back parts of your vertebrae, and they cut them all, the back parts off. And then they screw in these long stainless steel rods. And in my case, it was from the base of my neck to the base of my spine. They were going to fuse my entire spine to try to cantilever and pull the bone fragments off the cord and open up room for the spinal cord to flow up and down to the body. And I think if it was anybody else that I had seen an X-ray for, or a CAT scan or MRI, I probably would have recommended the Harrington rod surgery, but this was me. And I wasn't so quick to make that decision because I thought that I would be spending the rest of my life in pain, or at least on medications, or partially handicapped. And so I decided against the surgery. And of course, when you go against convention like that, you're always considered foolhardy and insane. But I was willing to weigh what I knew as in my studies against what I didn't know. And I was willing to take a chance and see if I could heal myself without having any surgical intervention. Of course, they thought I had post-traumatic stress disorder, I hit my head, and that I was not making any sense, or I wasn't being reasonable. But I just had this thought, I'm not going anywhere, I'm not doing anything, I'm laying face down. I had some neurological problems, of course, and I just thought, the power that made the body heals the body. And this vitalistic intelligence that's giving us life on a moment-to-moment basis is a consciousness, and a consciousness is an awareness, and awareness is paying attention. It's an intelligence, and it has an amazing will, it has an unlimited mind, and it's loving us in the life. And I thought, well, if my will could match its will, if my mind could match its mind, and my love for life could match its love for life, maybe I could make contact with it. Give it a plan, give it a template, give it a design. And when I was happy with that design, I knew that I couldn't do the healing, so I would surrender my creation to a greater mind and just see what the autonomic nervous system could do. So it sounds really easy, but I think that when we're in crisis or trauma, we tend to focus on what we don't want to have happen instead of what we do want to have happen. So I made a deal with myself that I was going to reconstruct my entire spine, and I wasn't going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I didn't want to experience. And so I went through about 6 or 7 weeks of total hell because I couldn't get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. I'd start off reconstructing the vertebrae in my spine, and then the next thing you know, I'd be thinking about living the rest of my life in a wheelchair. And I become conscious that I was focusing on what I didn't want to have happen instead of what I did want to have happen. Then I'd start from the very beginning again, and I'd reconstruct my spine, and then I'd be thinking about, should I sell my home? Should I sell my practice? And all the people in my life were telling me to sell everything. But if I accepted the belief on some level that I would be able to walk again, I should never sell my home and sell my practice. And so no one could relate with me. And I think that's the beginning of the dark night of the soul, when nobody gets you but you. And you're crossing a river of change, and you're weighing what you know against what you don't know. And you realize nobody has the answers but you. So in those 6 weeks, it would take me 2.5 hours to reconstruct my spine. And at the end of about 6 weeks, beginning of the 7th week, I went through the entire process without losing my focus. And it was like hitting a tennis ball in a sweet spot. Something clicked for me. And from that point on, everything got easier. I was able to do what I was doing in 2.5 hours in 45 minutes. Little did I know that I was firing and wiring circuits in my brain, and at the same time, I was increasing my ability to pay attention and stay present. And so when I started noticing those strong changes in my body, the numbness went away, the pain went away, I started having more motor function, I started to correlate what I was doing inside of me with the effects I was producing outside of me. And the moment I was able to correlate that connection, I did it with more passion, more sincerity, more enthusiasm, instead of dreading going through the process. And that was the switch for me, because from that moment on, my body started to respond to my mind very quickly. And they told me that I'd probably never walk again. They told me that I would have to live in a body cast for a year, and that I'd be handicapped in some way. And was back on my feet in a little less than 10 weeks. I was back training at 12 weeks. And to this day, I really have no pain in my spine. And I just made a deal with myself in those lonely nights, you know. I thought, if I'm ever able to walk again, I promise myself that I'll spend the rest of my life studying the mind-body connection and mind over matter. And that's what I've been doing since 1986. Actually, it was an 83-year-old woman.
Was it really?
Going 55 miles an hour. She shouldn't have even been on the course. And she didn't even know that she hit me. So my bicycle shot about 10 feet in the air, and the truck kept coming. And I just grabbed onto the bumper, and she dragged me down the road about 30 yards, and then she stopped short, and I just rolled down the road. I mean, there's an elaborate story that goes along with it. I mean, I had one side of my body was complete road rash. I mean, when I woke up the next morning from the injury, I was stuck to the sheets. My whole body they had to come with spray bottles and spray the sheets and slowly peel them off me. And I had gravel all in it was pretty crazy. But I never had any anger at all. I mean, because I knew that on some level that this was my initiation. And in order for us to be initiated, we have to be challenged. And I'm so glad that it happened, because I would never be where I am today or doing what I'm doing. And it also created a level of humility and understanding for me that I think that I needed at the time. And it just changed me. And the challenge is, of course, after you're initiated like that, you step back into your life and you can't relate with anybody anymore. You mean, what was I going to be unhappy about? I mean, I duff a golf shot and I was like, beautiful day. I mean, I just happy to be alive and standing up. So in a sense, that sparked an interest in something else. I wanted to know what happened to me. I wanted to know if anybody else understood this. I wanted to know the science behind it. And in no science could I find the explanation in the old models of science. I had to start looking at the quantum model of reality. I had to start looking at epigenetics. I had to start looking at neuroplasticity, psychoneuroimmunology, neuroendocrinology. I had to piece together a model of understanding, and at the same time, it stopped me enough to ask bigger questions like, who am I? You know, what am I doing here? What's my purpose in life? What happens when we die? Is it really about success? What is it about? And that started my inward journey in asking those big questions. I think that you have to open up doors of possibility and look to see for answers that aren't based in tradition or religion or culture. I think that those languages are dated. And I think science is the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science is what demystifies the mystical. And all of those new sciences point the finger at possibility. And for me, I understand now how it happened. And so what happened after that, I retreated from my life. I left Southern California. I moved to the Pacific Northwest. And I just disconnected, sold everything, sold my practice, and really just started to study and really try to piece it together. And then I got interested in spontaneous remissions. And I started saying, well, anybody else have these conditions? And so I traveled to 17 different countries and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people that were diagnosed with a medical condition. They were treating conventionally or unconventionally. They were staying the same or getting worse, and all of a sudden they got better. And I wanted to know what the cause was that produced that effect. And so I assembled 4 basic principles, which stood right in alignment with what happened to me, and wrote a book. And that book kind of was the science of changing your mind and how this all happens, and kind of gave the principles of those 4 specific relative commonalities. But then the next part of me was like, okay, well, I understand now that it happens to people, and they weren't mystics, they weren't spiritual. Some of them, ate meat. I mean, they're just all smoked cigarettes. There was just no commonality other than the fact that there was an element of mind involved in it. So I thought, if I know the principles, it happened to me, and these people have similar understandings, can I reproduce it? And so that's when I started to teach the practical aspect and to see if we were able to reproduce those changes. And I think for the first year, we didn't see many changes. And I don't know if I wasn't saying it well enough or it just was just the consciousness at the time. But after that first year, people started to lock in and start really applying it. And I have to say that common people are doing the uncommon, and they're healing themselves once they understand the what and the why. The how gets allowed. Well, I'll answer the question pretty much on a couple different levels. I think that when we talk about anxiety and depression on a functional brain scan looks exactly the same. Anxiety is when we are knocked out of balance, and when we are knocked out of homeostasis, or we're knocked out of balance, we turn on what's called the stress response. And when the stress response is turned on, we mobilize enormous amounts of the body's resources for some threat in our external environment. We turn on that sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight nervous system. When we begin to mobilize all that energy, of course, it gives the body a rush of adrenaline. And the fear or the anger or the aggression or the pain or the sadness that's created from the long-term effects of that tend to become a little bit addictive for people. Now, they don't know that, but over time, the addiction to those emotions connect to people and problems in their life. So they use the people and problems in their life to reaffirm an addiction to some emotion that they don't even know that they have. And if they don't like their life, they become addicted to the life they don't even like. And so just like an addict that's addicted to some substance, when you have to break that addiction, of course, there's withdrawals, and you start having images and cravings. And that's exactly what the brain does when it's going through an emotional withdrawal. So if a person has a trauma in their life and it brands them emotionally, the moment we feel a change in our internal chemistry, we pay attention to what causes it in our external environment, and the brain takes a snapshot, and that's called a memory. The higher the emotional quotient, the stronger the long-term memory. So there's nothing wrong with that, except that when we're in survival and we're living in stress, we tend to anticipate that scenario happening again. And we actually plan for it unconsciously. And we begin to select a future potential. And we begin to emotionally embrace that outcome. Now, here's the challenge. When you combine a thought with an emotion, you're creating a state of being. Because thoughts are the vocabulary of the brain, and feelings are the vocabulary of your body. And how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. So combination of selecting the worst case scenario in your life and emotionally embracing it is turning on the stress response just by thought alone. Now, when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease, because no organism can live in emergency mode for extended periods of time. If you're tapping the body's resources for some external threat for the short term, that's great. When the stress is over, the body returns back to homeostasis, and of course the body builds its resources again. But if you keep turning on that stress response and you can't turn it off, and you're mobilizing all this energy for some threat in your external environment, there's no energy in your internal environment for growth and repair. There's no energy for long-term building projects. It's like there's a war out there, and you're sending all the troops out, and there's no homeland security. So as stress hormones go up, immune function goes down. It's a fact. And when that happens, melatonin levels go down, of course, which means you're not going to want to sleep, because if there's a predator out there, why would you be vulnerable in the middle of the night? You got to stay awake. So the survival gene switches on, and we get in trouble. And so if it's not a predator that's in the cave or outside the cave waiting for you, which was highly adaptive thousands of years ago, but what if it's your coworker that's sitting at the cubicle next to you, who you resent and despise? Well, that primitive nervous system that was once adaptive is now very maladaptive. But if we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, then as we begin to select that future worst case scenario, and by the way, we'll even go, well, let's make it worse. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And we start to develop this model. And as we hold that image in our mind, the body, as the unconscious mind, is beginning to believe it's living in that future reality in the present moment. And the body's getting knocked out of balance by thought alone, because it doesn't know the difference between the experience in our life that produces the emotion and the emotion that we create by thought alone. To the body, it's exactly the same. So the redundancy of holding that thought, combining it with the emotion, creating a state of being over and over again, conditions the body to subconsciously become the mind of fear. So now it's programmed subconsciously. So then anxiety is selecting the worst case scenario in your life and emotionally embracing it until you condition the body to become the mind of fear. And if you get really good at it, the body's going to have a panic attack without you. Try as you may to control it with your conscious mind. You cannot. You programmed it subconsciously. The flip side of the coin is depression. A person has a turbulent past, or is shocked or betrayed in some way. And of course, when they create that long-term memory, they're associating some person, something, and some place and some time with that event. And so what they don't know is that after the trauma or the betrayal, every time they remember the experience or think about it, they're producing the same chemistry in their brain and body as if the event was occurring. So now the body, as the unconscious mind, is believing it's in the same past scenario 50 to 100 times in one day. And if those emotions tend to drive our thoughts, and our thoughts then produce more of those emotions, and our emotions drive more thoughts, now the repetition of that cycle conditions the body to become the mind of depression or hopelessness or powerlessness. So now the body's stuck in the past. The person wants to get up and do something, and the body says, you conditioned me to be this way. And of course, our biology, our neurocircuitry, our neurochemistry, and even our genes change as a result of it. So then, the fact that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and it's a scientific fact that the long-term effects of the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease, then by the very nature of those chemicals, our thoughts can make us sick. So the question is, if our thoughts can make us sick, is it possible that our thoughts can make us well? And that's the fundamental question that needs to be asked, because so many people have been conditioned and hypnotized into believing that they need something outside of them to change how they feel inside of them. Now, I don't have a problem with pharmaceuticals, and I don't have a problem with medicine, and I think it really works for acute conditions. You break your arm, you have appendicitis. Acute care is great, works great when medicine is, medical care works really great when there's an acute condition. But chronic conditions tend to be the challenge because chronic conditions require a lifestyle change. And if there's no chemical change that's going to intervene to reduce a chronic condition, a person has to begin to make different choices. They have to demonstrate different behaviors. They have to create new experiences. They have to change the way they think. They have to change the way they feel. And that requires them becoming conscious of how unconscious they were. So then, chronic stress and chronic conditions that require a lifestyle change then means then that the person is going to have to go from an old state of mind and body to a new state of mind and body. And making that choice to do that is going to be uncomfortable because you're stepping outside the known. And when you're living in stress, the unknown is a very scary place. So people cling to their fear. They cling to their guilt. They cling to their sadness. They would rather hold on to that than take a chance and possibility because in survival or in stress, it's not a time to create. It's not a time to imagine. It's not a time to learn. It's not a time to open your heart. It's not a time to go within. It's not a time to sit still. It's a time to run, to fight, or to hide. And when that primitive nervous system is activated and it switches on for extended periods of time, the very nature of those chemicals cause us to put a lot of attention on our body. When you're being chased by Mr. Big, you better make sure you're paying attention to your body. When you're in a survival situation, all of your attention is on your outer world, where the danger is, the person, the thing, place. We focus on matter. We narrow our focus on things and people. We put our attention on our environment. And when we're living by the hormones of stress, our attention is on time. We obsess about time, the body, the environment, and time. And the very nature of those chemicals causes our senses to become heightened. We become materialists that have to define reality with our senses. And if we can't see it, we can't hear it, we can't smell it, we can't feel it, we can't taste it, it doesn't exist. So from the quantum perspective, we're focusing on the particle, and yet there is a wave of possibility that we edit out. So in chronic stress, the reason that chronic conditions are so heightened in our world right now is because that chronic state of imbalance of the stress response becomes the new balance. And then the person then is looking for things outside of them to bring themselves back into balance. Now, that's okay for the short term, but what if your stress is adding up and adding up and adding up, and then all of a sudden, we tend to try to force outcomes, control outcomes, predict outcomes, because we feel powerless. We are matter, in a sense, trying to change matter. And there's only a few resources that we have. We compete, we fight, we force, we manipulate, we deceive, we do what we can to get what we need. And so, amazing time in history right now, because people are beginning to wake up to the idea that it's more important for them to regulate internal states independent of the conditions in their external environment. And when we begin to break that conditioning that something outside of us is going to change how we feel inside of us, we start taking responsibility for the way we manage our thoughts, the way we manage our emotions, the choices we make, the behaviors we demonstrate, the experiences we want and we don't want. And I think it's that kind of shift that begins to bring people back into balance. Unfortunately, people love to wait for crisis or trauma or disease or diagnosis or loss to finally make up their mind to change. And my message is, why wait? You can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, or you can learn and change in a state of joy and inspiration. So our research that we've done just in the last year, we took 120 people and we measured their cortisol levels, and we measured their immune system response, a chemical called IgA, immunoglobulin A. It's the primary defense against bacteria and viruses. It's better than any flu shot. It's the body's innate mechanism for internal protection. So as cortisol levels go up, as stress hormones go up, and you're tapping the body's resources, immune function goes down. And that's a scientific fact. So we took 117 people and we measured their cortisol levels and IgA levels before they started a 4-day event. And I said, okay, what if we teach them how to create elevated emotions like gratitude, like joy, like inspiration, and let's measure what happens to their heart to make sure that they're regulating this state properly. Turns out when you're living in fear, when you're living in resentment, when you're living in anger and impatience, the heart beats very incoherently. And the mechanism of sustained stress over time causes heart problems. So when a person starts to feel more coherent, elevated emotions, the heart starts getting very orderly and very rhythmic, and it sends a very strong signal to the brain, and the person starts to relax. They start to feel safe. They start to change their breathing. They start to expand their energy. Everything changes because the person's falling into the present moment. And they're changing their brain waves when they do that from the vigilant state of high beta brainwave patterns, when we're obsessing about something and trying to control everything, to beginning to slow their brainwaves down into more of an alpha coherent state. And that imagination, creative state is the perfect state to be in when we're executing in our life. So we measured their ability to create elevated emotions. And we asked them to sustain those elevated states for 10 minutes a day, 3 times a day, for about 4 days. So my thought was, well, if cortisol levels downregulate the gene to make IgA, which is a protein, and all genes make proteins, what if an elevated emotion could upregulate the gene for IgA and all of a sudden increase the IgA levels? At the end of 4 days, we had a 49.5% increase in immunoglobulin A just by changing our emotional state. So now, let's look at the mechanics of this. If you're living in the same emotional state every single day, as I said earlier, your body, as the unconscious mind, is believing it's in some environmental condition because the emotion is the end product of an experience in your environment. The latest research on genes tells us genes don't create disease. It's the environment that signals the gene to create disease. Well, an experience in an environment produces an emotion. So it's the emotion that signals the gene to either upregulate and make a healthy protein or downregulate and shut a protein off. So in a matter of 4 days, people were able to upregulate the gene to increase their immune function just by thought alone. So 10 minutes of gratitude a day, the worst thing that could happen to you is it could heal you. Well, it's fascinating that you can give someone a sugar pill, a saline injection, or perform some false surgery or treatment. And a certain percentage of those people will accept, believe, and surrender to the thought without any analysis that they're getting the real substance or treatment. And they begin to program their autonomic nervous system to make the exact pharmacy of chemicals equal to the substance or treatment they think they're getting. So the fundamental question is it the inert substance, the placebo, that's doing the healing, or is it the body's innate capacity to heal by thought alone? So blue pills work better than red pills. If you name a pill that rhymes with something that it could increase its ability for, it'll work better. People will subconsciously associate with it. If you name a drug something that a person can't pronounce, they'll give their power away to the drug and it'll work even better. They'll be intimidated by it. If you charge more for a medication, it will work better. And if the doctor's enthusiastic about it, it'll work even better. So that pill, that sugar pill, works because a person's gotten a substance that they've taken that's taken away their pain, or it's changed their internal state. The moment they notice a change in their body, they pay attention to what caused it, and they start to condition themselves to rely on that substance. You give the person the pill the next day, you give the person the pill the next day, you give the person the pill the next day, conditioning, conditioning, conditioning. Then you give them a pill that looks just like that pill, and it's nothing more than starch or sugar, and their body begins to produce the same chemistry. So when they get that pill that's an inert substance, if conditioning is based on the past, then expectation is based on the future. They begin to expect the same outcome as the past, and the anticipation of the event causes the body to naturally begin to make its own chemicals. So that pill then is a symbol of possibility. And the moment that person gets that pill, they begin to select a potential in the quantum field called getting better. And a certain percentage of those people will begin to become optimistic, excited, inspired, grateful. And when you combine a clear intention with an elevated emotion, you just changed your biology from living in the past present reality to living in a future present reality. And when a person moves into that future present reality, they're in a new state of being. And that will begin to program their autonomic nervous system to make the pharmaceuticals equal to the substance they think they're taking. So the fundamental question is, do you need a sugar pill? Do you need a saline injection to do that? Or can you combine a clear intention with an elevated emotion and move into a new state of being? In other words, instead of selecting a known, selecting an unknown, and keep revisiting that unknown until it becomes a known and your biology begins to change. And the answer is absolutely yes. So my interest was, okay, so if I understood the mechanics of the placebo and how it works from a scientific standpoint, can you teach people to do it? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, there's some conditions. For example, in depression studies, 81% of people that are in a depression study get better in taking a placebo, or the substance, the placebo, works as well as the antidepressant that the control group is taking. So 81% of those people are making their own antidepressants by thought alone. You can do a functional brain scan before and you do a functional brain scan after, and you can see visible changes in their brain. In other words, it's not in their mind, it's in their brain. But those people took that placebo for 8 weeks. So every single day, they were reminding themselves of that future reality and changing their state of being. And at the end of 8 weeks, they had biological changes. So there's no panacea like you do it once, although the placebo sometimes works that way, and we see that sometimes in our work. But if it took 8 weeks for those people to move into a state of being every single day to change their biology and physiology, then it may take us 8 weeks to heal ourselves from depression, and we just have to stay at it for that extended period of time. And it means then we would have to break the conditioning that we need something outside of us to do that. And that's just a belief, and that's just how we've been programmed. Well, I can tell you that I have no doubt that it's absolutely possible to do it. We get emails every single day. People that were in chronic pain, people with rheumatoid arthritis, people with lupus, people with depression, people with anxiety, people with cancer, people with rare genetic disorders that medical science has no solution for, that have completely upregulated their genes, changed their biological presentation, and they've healed. Well, I could probably talk about that for 2 hours. I mean, I start off my book with this story of a man who was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctor gave him a certain period of time to live. And when he got the diagnosis, he said, look, I just want to live long enough to make it through Christmas with my family. And after that, just can we, I don't care what happens, but can you keep me alive to that point? So they checked his values, and, he was doing okay. And a week after the sentence that he got on how long he would be living after the diagnosis, a week later, he passed. But when they did the autopsy on him, he had no cancer, not even enough to kill him. So he died by thought alone. That's how powerful belief is. But I mean, you can take a group of people that have Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is deficiency in dopamine in the brain. When there's not enough dopamine in the brain, the upper motor neurons can't communicate with each other, and all of a sudden the motor neurons cause a spastic paralysis or tremors. People with Parkinson's can't control that with their conscious mind. So they did an experiment where they told these participants that they had one of the most powerful new drugs to treat Parkinson's. And after the saline injection, more than 50% of those people, all of their symptoms went away. Now, this is the cool part of the story, because the doctors that did the experiment said, well, that's just the placebo. And one doctor said, well, okay, well, if their tremors went away, is it possible that they're making their own dopamine? So what they did was they found a radioactive chemical that fit into the same receptor sites as dopamine. So think of receptor sites as parking spaces. If the Parkinson's patients were making their own dopamine by thought alone, then dopamine would get to the parking spaces first. And when they injected the radioactive dye, there would be no radioactivity in the brain because dopamine got there first. If they weren't making their own dopamine, then there'd be a lot of parking spaces, and all of a sudden, when they injected the radioactive dye, it would fit into those receptor sites, and when they imaged the brain would light up. Turns out these people were making 200 times the amount of dopamine just by thought alone. Now, there's a caveat to the story, because when those people returned back to their life, all of their symptoms came back. Now, the question is why? Because when they saw their caregiver, when they played chess with their friends, when they saw their spouse, when they slept in the same bed, the environment began to remind them by association who they were as an identity, and they returned back to their past biology. And of course, then, the next question is, if the environment is that strong, it should be a good idea every single day that we change our state of being to be greater than our environment. So yes, people that are treating for chronic conditions, the question that I ask them is, tell me, how long do you think it took you to develop this condition? Tell me the choices that you made. Tell me how your stress levels were. Tell me about your past, your traumas. And they can tell a narrative that usually is years. And I always tell them, okay, so it took you 2 years or 3 years to create this condition. And you're going to have to turn this battleship around. And by turning it around to uncreate it, it's going to take you a little time. So every day, you have to overcome some aspect of yourself. Overcome until you become someone else. Well, we do a lot of mental imaging in our work, and I kind of move past the word visualization because I think it kind of conjures up a little bit too much of a spiritual association. The word that's used in science is called mental rehearsal. And mental rehearsal, there's two types of mental rehearsal. There's what's called internal mental imaging, which means you're in the scene as the first person experiencing it. And then there's called external mental imaging, which is you're observing yourself in the scene. Turns out that when you are actually in the first person and not the third person, that action of rehearsing what you're doing produces the strong biological change. Now let's talk about this. You can take a group of people that have never played the piano before, and you can do a functional brain scan on them, and then you can teach them one-handed scales and chords, and they'll practice those chords 2 hours a day for 5 days. At the end of 5 days, they grow a whole new set of circuits on the opposite side of the brain. Well, that makes sense. You learn something new. Learning is making new synaptic connections. You get your body involved with some instruction. When you get your body involved, you're going to have a new experience. Experience enriches the brain. You pay attention to what you're doing. You got to pay attention. You got to stay present. And if you repeat it over and over again, firing and wiring, you assemble new networks of neurons equal to your experience. Nothing new there. But you can take a group of people and you can have them close their eyes, do a brain scan on them before the experiment, 5 days later do a brain scan after. And for 2 hours a day, they mentally rehearse playing those scales and chords. At the end of 5 days, they grow the same amount of circuits in their brain as the people actually physically doing the exercise. So what's the relevance? Number one, when you're truly focused and you're truly paying attention, Your brain does not know the difference between what's going on out there and what's going on in here. So the thought becomes the experience, and the brain looks like it's been playing the piano for the last 5 days, but they never lifted a finger. Now, from a biological standpoint, our brains are a record of the past. They're an artifact of everything we've learned and experienced to this moment. When we prime the brain to change its circuitry before the experience, now the brain is no longer a record of the past. It's now a map to the future. And so as we warm up those brain circuits, it's more easy for us to slip into a supernatural behavior. If you take those people and you set them from the piano, and they've never played the piano before, but they've been mentally rehearsing for the last 5 days, they'll play those scales and chords. Like magic. They just learned how to do it just by changing their internal state. Take a group of men. You can have them close their eyes and for an hour a day, mentally rehearse doing bicep curls over and over again, and they add an emotional component called harder, stronger, more intense, and they put themselves in that first-person internal mental image. At the end of 2 weeks, they have a 13.5 increase in muscle strength, and they've never performed the activity. Now, not only is the brain changed to look like the experience has already occurred, now the body has changed by thought alone. The body looks like it's been working out for the last 2 weeks. So then, the power of mental rehearsal, of imaging, primes the brain and body to look like the future has already occurred. And when you set the extent of your limit, and you can image what you can do even further than what's normal, then you are stepping into the unknown. And of course, then your body is going to follow your mind because the experience has already happened. In February of 2017, this year, we did a trial where we measured 7,500 gene regulations. And I wanted to see if our students, by thinking differently, making different choices, demonstrating different behaviors, creating some novel experiences, and changing their emotional state, if they were able to upregulate genes and to understand why students in our work heal from cancer, why they heal from inflammation, why their bodies begin to change. Now, your body is a protein-producing machine, and proteins are responsible for the structure of your body and the function of your body. And the expression of proteins really is the expression of life. And so, in order for every cell in your body except red blood cells to make a protein, a gene has to be regulated. So genes are like Christmas tree lights. They're turning on and off all the time. When they turn on, or when they become regulated, they upregulate and they make a new protein. When they downregulate, they shut off and stop making that protein. So if you're thinking the same way, if you're making the same choices, you're demonstrating the same behaviors, you're creating the same experiences, producing the same emotions, you keep the same lights on and the other lights off, and now you're headed for a genetic destiny. So we found just in our research that when people really understand what they're doing from an internal process, that they could regulate and change their genetic expression, and that's exactly what happened. We had a lot of genes upregulated, but we had 9 very important genes, and one of them was the gene to suppress cancer growth. Another one was nerve cells actually regenerating, actually not just making new connections, but growing new neurons as the result of novel experiences. In addition to that, the gene that makes antioxidants, that creates youth and longevity, was activated. The gene for stem cells to become activated and migrate to an area of damaged tissue and regenerate it was activated as well. So I now know that we can regulate genes, and when those genes become regulated, they make proteins that begin to heal the body. So it's not uncommon then. The reason I did the research was because we have a lot of students in our work that were diagnosed with cancer. And cancer, of course, then, every time a person hears the word cancer and they're given that diagnosis, the first emotion that they feel is fear. And the moment they feel fear, no new information can enter their nervous system that is not equal to that emotional state. In other words, they'll only accept, believe, and surrender to the thoughts equal to that emotional state. So they get the diagnosis of fear. All of a sudden, their body's altered internally. They're looking at the doctor. They're taking a snapshot of that moment. They're creating a long-term memory. Every time they think about what the doctor said, they're conditioning their body to become the mind of fear. They can, with all of their conscious mind, which is 5% of who we are, say, I'm going to be healthy, 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 I'm going to be well, I'm well, I'm well. And that thought's going to stop right at the brainstem and never make it to the body because it's not in alignment with our emotional state. So then people when they hear the voodoo curse, when they get the death sentence, 3 months to live, 6 months to live, 9 months to live, 12 months to live, that information goes right in and it begins to program their autonomic nervous system to that outcome. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is then the person is at a war with themselves because they're waiting for the diagnosis to change, to feel the relief from the fear and emptiness that they're experiencing. And that's separation, that's lack. What we now know is that change a person's emotional state and teach them how to regulate those states, not just for 5 minutes. And we have people that have mastered it, that can regulate heart coherence or an elevated emotion for an hour. So think about this. You change a person's emotional state from fear to gratitude. The emotional signature of gratitude means it has already happened. People give thanks when they get something, so gratitude is a state of receivership. Change a person's state to a state of gratitude, then they will accept, believe, and surrender to the thoughts equal to that emotional state, and they begin to program their autonomic nervous system into a different destiny. So that's the easy part. The challenge is to get beyond the emotional addiction of fear, to get beyond our doubt, to get beyond feeling terrible and not doing the work because we don't feel better or don't feel good. Getting beyond the stress in our life of trying to manage our world while we're facing a health condition. This is the challenge. But we had a lady that is a psychotherapist. And some years back, her husband went to the tallest building in Holland. While she was in the shower, he left, said goodbye to the kids, went to the tallest building in Holland, and jumped off the top of that building and committed suicide. She was waiting for her husband to come home. She didn't know where he was. It was Sunday morning. She's reading some papers in psychology. The kids are playing. Police officers come to the door and they give her the news. Of course, the moment she hears the news, it's a stressful moment. And the moment she feels that change in her internal chemistry, of course, she pays attention to what caused it and she creates a long-term memory. The children were upset. She was angry, she was sad, she was confused, she was guilty, she was every single emotion you can experience. She went through all the stress hormone emotions. And every time she thought about that event, she was producing the same chemistry in her brain and body. And of course, she was conditioning her body into the past. And of course, when you have an experience like that, people in your life treat you equal to the experience, and that becomes your identity. And so you tell the story over and over again, reaffirming it. And she found out after her husband committed suicide that he left her in a very difficult financial situation. Huge debt, successful attorney, but she knew nothing about it. So now her stress levels go up even more, because now it's not only is she facing a suicide or a loss, but now she's got a lot of debt. So then over time, she wakes up one morning and she's completely paralyzed from her waist down. She can't get out of bed. She can't move. They rush her to the hospital. And of course, she has a gross inflammation in her body, but there's no mechanical problem. She's in the hospital for an extended period of time. She can't feel her legs. She can't move her legs. She can't take care of her kids. She can't work. Now she can't pay all the debts that she has. Stress levels go up even more. Took her a couple weeks to finally get out of the hospital. She still couldn't walk on one leg. She walked with a walker and crutches, couldn't take care of her kids. Depression sets in, stress levels go up. A few months later, she develops all of these ulcerations on all the mucous membranes of her body, her esophagus, her upper gut, her vagina, her anus, all her mucous membranes are ulcerated. Now she can't eat. And now if you can't eat, you can become chemically imbalanced. So now she's emotionally imbalanced, and now she's chemically imbalanced, and she's physically imbalanced because she's injured. So a few months after that, she's having problems swallowing, and they find a tumor above her stomach, and she has esophageal cancer. And the doctor told her that she had a very short amount of time to live. Now, she came to a workshop that we were doing in Holland. And I remember the day she came in, because she came in with crutches, and she sat in a room of about 500 people on the side, and I saw her walker and her crutches. Now, she's a psychologist, a psychotherapist. She's an educated woman. She's got a master's. She treats conditions. She could, from a psychological standpoint, have the insight of how it all happened, but she couldn't change it. She did one chemotherapy treatment for the cancer, and she said it just about killed her, and she stopped. So she came to our event, and she started doing the work, and she had a lot of doubt, and she had a lot of fear. She didn't feel like doing her meditation certain days, but every single day, by creating the elevated emotion combined with a clear intention and changing her state of being and overcoming the past every single day, in a matter of about a year, all of her cancer disappeared. The tumor shrunk. All the ulcerations and all our mucous membranes went away. She has no paralysis, no pain. She has no depression. She owns a hospital now in Holland. She's one of my executive corporate trainers. And she has a new husband and a great guy. And he's a successful person. And she's in love with life. And so we have people that heal from cancer quite a bit. And I'm going to tell you, it takes an uncompromising will to do it. But the beauty behind it is when she stands on the stage and she tells her story, and she doesn't look any different than anybody else. She's not wearing white. She's not young and fit. She's just a common person. That so many people, when they hear the story, begin to change their belief about what's possible. And because of her and a few other people that healed themselves of ovarian cancer and a few other big cancers, when they tell their story, more and more people are accepting that it's possible, and that's how we change the paradigm. It's no longer the philosophical component that does it. It's the example of it that does it. And to me, she's the living example of truth. So the interesting thing about that is that if you ask her about her past, she will tell you that it was the best thing that ever happened to her. And if you ask her about her disease, she will tell you the disease lives in the old personality. I'm literally somebody else. And just like a person with a multiple personality disorder that has an allergy to nylon stockings in one personality and type 2 diabetes in another personality, she literally became someone else. And the disease exists in the old person. Now, the beauty behind her is that she understood that the emotion, if she could truly be present and hold an image and rehearse a future and begin to create the emotion, her brain and body would change from living in the past to living in the future. So then if she's feeling fear every single day, then she's in the past. Because the moment she wakes up and searches for that feeling and she gets in touch with that feeling, the feeling is a record of the past and starts influencing her thoughts, then her entire state of being is in the past. Every day as she starts overcoming those emotions and those doubts and those thoughts and attitudes and hardwired behaviors, she's changing her neurocircuitry, she's changing her chemistry, she's changing her hormones, she's even changing her genes. And because she studied it and she understood what she was doing and why, and the how got easier. And she said, which I thought was so beautiful, I'm not getting up from this meditation until I'm in love with life. Now, to the materialist who's looking for evidence, She has no reason to be in love with life. She lost her husband. She was in financial crisis. She lost her job. She had no friends. She couldn't take care of her kids. She was paralyzed. She had cancer. She had depression. She had ulcerations. But she said, I'm going to teach my body emotionally what my future is going to feel like before it's made manifest. And over time, overcoming, she became someone else. And I just had dinner with her in Switzerland last month. And she said, I'm so in love with my life. And I said, of course you are. You created your life from a place of being in love with life. The challenge behind all of this is that people have to understand that there is a journey that they have to take. In other words, 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors, emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes, behaviors that function like a subconscious computer program. 95% of who we are is a habit. And it's programmed in the body. If you keep doing something so many times, the body knows now how to do it better than your brain. So if that's 95% of who we are, the body becomes the mind, and most of the time people are unconscious. So they're unconscious to the way they think. They're unaware of how they act, what they look like. They're not even aware of what they're feeling because it just feels like their normal self. So then to go from the old self to the new self, you got to cross a river. And stepping into that river, the hardest part about change is not making the same choices you did the day before. And the moment you decide to make a different choice, get ready because it's going to be uncomfortable. And so then the moment they step into that river of change, the body has been conditioned to be the mind. The body doesn't like the uncertainty. It would rather cling to its guilt. It would rather cling to its unworthiness, to its fear. So then the moment the body starts feeling uncomfortable and it's been conditioned to be the mind, it starts sending signals back to the brain. And the brain starts going, you start tomorrow, this isn't really going to work for you. No, it doesn't. It's not the truth. You're a failure. You're too much like your mother. You'll never change. This doesn't feel right. That's the body trying to unseat us. And if we respond to that thought or that voice as if it's true, that thought, that same thought leads to the same choice, leads to the same behavior, creates the same experience, produces the same emotion. And then we say, oh, this feels right. Well, no, that feels familiar. Going from the old self to the new self is the neurological, is the biological, is the chemical, the hormonal, genetic death of the old self. But we don't want to white knuckle it when we're in that unknown, we're in that void. The question is, what thoughts do you want to fire and wire in your brain? What do you want to put your attention behind? What behaviors do you want to demonstrate today in one lifetime? The act of rehearsing your behaviors begins to install the circuits in your brain, priming your brain for the future. And if you keep installing the hardware over and over again, the hardware is going to become a software program. And who knows, you may start thinking like an unlimited person. You may start feeling and behaving like a healthy person. And then, of course, can you teach your body emotionally what that future is going to feel like before it's made manifest? That means you don't wait for your healing to feel wholeness. You don't wait for your wealth to feel success. You don't wait for the mystical moment to feel awe. That's the old model of reality of cause and effect. Waiting for something outside of us to change how we feel inside of us. And when we feel better inside of us, we pay attention to whoever caused it. What if it doesn't happen? Then we spend the majority of our life in lack, waiting for it to happen. The quantum model of reality is about cause and effect. The moment we start feeling whole, our healing begins. The moment we're in awe of life, we're going to have a mystical experience. The moment we feel worthy and abundant, our wealth is coming. The moment we feel empowered, we're moving towards our success. The moment we're in love with life, in love with ourselves, our world changes. That's causing an effect. So the model then of change is becoming conscious of our unconscious self. And the word meditation literally means to become familiar with. So if 95% of who we are is hardwired and conditioned, you got to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. You got to become aware of how you act and what your habits are. So familiar, so conscious of it, that you would never go unconscious again. And then you got to look at those emotions that keep you anchored to the past and decide, do these emotions belong in my future? And I think that most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality. It doesn't work. We literally have to become someone else. So then as you cross the river and you say, what thoughts do I want to fire and wire in my brain? What behaviors do I want to demonstrate? If you keep firing and wiring those circuits over and over again, it's going to begin to become familiar to you. And if you keep cultivating elevated emotional states, just like you cultivate fear or guilt, if you keep doing that enough times, it's going to begin to become familiar to you. And over time, you change and transition. And so we use the model of meditation because the whole purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind. And what separates the conscious mind from the subconscious mind is the analytical mind. So then we have ways and different meditations to teach our students how to change their brainwaves from that high alert beta brainwave state that switches on when a person's in chronic stress, to be able to regulate and change their brainwaves, to teach them how to go from focusing on matter and objects and things to focusing on nothing, to focusing on space, to go from a narrow focus to an open focus. And when that occurs, brainwaves begin to slow down. And if they're sensing space and they're not analyzing and thinking, different compartments of the brain that were once subdivided because of the hormones of stress, because they're shifting their attention to their kids, to their wife, to their job, to their problems, to their cell phone, to their emails. Each one of those things is a neurological network in our brain. Keep doing that, the brain starts firing incoherently. When the brain's incoherent, we're incoherent. When the brain isn't working right, we're not working right. So by regulating and changing brain waves and teaching our students how to do it, in time then the brain starts to synchronize. If you're no longer analyzing and thinking, the autonomic nervous system steps in, which is its job is to create order and balance. As your brain waves change, you begin to make contact and go from beta brain waves to alpha brain waves. And when that occurs, all of a sudden, different compartments of the brain that were once subdivided start to synchronize. And what syncs in the brain links in the brain. And all of a sudden, we start feeling more whole. And it's the autonomic nervous system then that starts to regulate balance in the neocortex. And we start feeling more in balance. So to regulate and change the brainwaves, when you go from beta to alpha, you're moving right beyond the analytical mind. Now you're in the operating system where those programs exist and where true change can take place. And so our students can change their brainwaves in 4 seconds, in 5 seconds, in 9 seconds, in 13 seconds. And it's not like a race to get there. It's just a skill. They just know how to do it. And so when they get into the operating system and they change those associations or those emotions or those habits into more productive ones, of course, when they present themselves to the world, there's some change in the process. So we use the model of meditation as a means to do it. And there's different meditations that we use, of course. And we like our students to do the work every day, and our students don't go, oh gosh, I got to meditate today. They've had so many instrumental effects because of it that they look forward to it, because not only does their biology change, but their life changes. And I think that's the benefit, because then by changing ourselves and presenting ourselves to the world, of course, we give people permission to do the same. And the side effect of that is we begin to change the world. So we have 3 types of stress: physical, chemical, and emotional. Physical stress, of course, is trauma, injuries, accidents, falls. Chemical stress is flus, bacterial infections, blood sugar levels, hangovers. Emotional stress, family tragedies, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks. All of those things knock the brain and body out of balance. So if we have 3 types of stress that knock the body out of balance, then there's 3 ways to create balance back in the body: physically, chemically, and emotionally. In 31 years of practice, I can tell you when you get 2 out of those 3 in order with a chronic condition, the majority of time, the 3rd one always comes around. Person's physically out of balance. And emotionally out of balance. If you get the more physically imbalanced and emotionally imbalanced, they're going to be more chemically imbalanced. Get someone more chemically balanced, more emotionally balanced, they're going to be more physically balanced. And so then it's a combination of all those things with chronic conditions. And so whether the person wants to pick the right foods to keep her body chemically in balance, take the right supplements, work on their emotional state, of course, they're going to become more physically balanced. A person starts working out and doing yoga, doing explosive exercise, whatever it is, and they're making the proper food choices and keeping their body chemically in balance, they're going to start feeling more emotionally in balance, which is going to help them make better choices for the physical and chemical state. And I think that's how we climb out of the hole with chronic